Gornanisha was depressed at the idea. She was depressed at the idea that she would have to spend time on a human vessel. Humans, though not fully the newest race in the galactic community, were very far away from her home sector, not even close to neighbors, but each decided to do an exchange program, as in they would trade personnel to work on each other's ships to see how each group operated. Each one of the ships, they would monitor how each crew operated, how each engine operated, how each helmsman, and so on and so forth. She was considered one of the best, as her observational skills were far beyond what anyone had expected. She had breezed through all of her courses and was expecting to be placed on some sort of embassy guard, some sort of detail that was going to be cushy and lavish and full of extra pay, but instead, what did she get? She got assigned to a human vessel, and she loathed the idea. She had never actually met a human before. She waited until it was going to be time to actually get on the ship. Some said that they were mean, some said that they were kind, some said that they're odd to look at. Everyone said that they are some of the most interesting personnel you will ever come across. She was hoping that this interesting part would be what kept her from being bored. She did not expect much from humanity at all. Not from a single person, not from their entire species. In fact, she looked at them with such disdain that it was impossible to hide. Absolutely impossible. Even more so as she looked out the window from the observation deck at the human ship she would be serving on. She grimaced at the sight of it. Now, most species, once they reach the outside of their own cradle, will simply use aesthetics in their ships. Everyone looks a certain way, whether it be rounded edges, angles, stretched out, stout, boxy, circular, cube, sphere, it doesn't matter. They were all pretty much identifiable very, very quickly by their shape. And many of them had extra parts on the outside of their hull simply for aesthetic reasons, which made them seem as though they were gliding through space. Everyone enjoyed this. It brought a little beauty to the darkness of space. But as she looked out to the human ship, all she saw was what she was told she was going to see. A flying brick. It was several different portions kind of slammed together, seemingly haphazardly. She looked at the ship and kind of cringed at the idea. It was a giant space hulk that seemed to have an engine on the back or front end. She couldn't tell. She knew the humans used a type of gravimetric drive, but she didn't fully understand it yet. I guess that was one thing that would be interesting about them. As the ship got closer and closer, it was obvious that the humans had come up to one side so that they could dock with her ship. Surprisingly, all the hard points lined up. This must be what they meant by interesting, as she couldn't tell where the hard points were at first, at least until the umbilical came out to dock with the ship she was in. Hastily, she went down to the decks and met up with the captain. The captain scolded her for being a little late, but since the humans had not actually shown up yet, she showed that she was just on time. The captain did his version of an eye roll, which was simply to bring down his eye stalks and then bring them up again. Gornisha understood this, as she had worked with the Yucca before. The Yucca were an insectoid, almost Cretaceous type species, though they were very, very straight to the point. You would never actually find a Yucca that was capable of lying, but you would find one capable of assembling a ship from a box of scraps. This was one of the few reasons why everyone dealt with them, even though they didn't want to, as they had the personality of a bulkhead. Gornisha sat what seemingly took an hour, but was most likely only 1 minute, before she heard the telltale signs of bipeds walking through. The shake from the umbilical was enough to send enough sound waves through that she could hear it. The doors opened, and she saw the humans for the first time. At least she thought she did. As it turns out, the humans showed up in a type of suit. Each of these suits seemed to be custom to each one, as they began to scan the area very quickly. After a few seconds, their sensors seemed to beep, and they simply turned them off. Seemingly secured with their safety, they simply reached out one of their appendages and welcomed everyone to their sector. Welcome to the Soul Sector. You could barely hear anything through the suit itself. Then the human reached up, pressed the button, and you could hear, "Oh, sorry about that. Welcome to the Soul Sector. We're here to pick up a Miss, checking his readout, Gornanishia." She immediately snapped at them. The humans seemed to be only slightly amused at her outburst. However, they simply waved and said, "This way, please. Do you have all your items with you?" She looked kind of confused. "Items? Your personal belongings." "I have everything here." She simply waved at the harness that she was wearing. It then occurred to the humans that this was everything she was going to bring. They were a little put back at this, until one of the humans, with a much lighter voice, "Don't you have a change of clothes? It's going to be a little cold if all that's you're going to wear." Gornaricia looked down, confused at her garbs. This was what all her species wore. They did not care much for clothing. Clothing always seemed to get in the way, although more and more of her population was earning the modicum of the immodest ones because of this. This was the only reason that she had decided to put on anything at all. It seemed this bothered the humans a little bit, though they seemed to pass it away very quickly. As Gornicia was being escorted into the umbilical so they could reach the other ship, the captain of the Yucca group said, "We did not do this trade for free," reminding them that there was payment due. The one in charge of the human group said, "Absolutely," reached back and motioned to one of his subordinates. The subordinate simply brought forward 2 cases that he had been holding and placed them down with an audible thump. Everyone knew what this was. Everybody knew what the Yucca wanted from the humans, what was always welcome in trade. They opened the case and immediately sniffed the air. Coffee. Yes, it's strong stuff. You might want to go easy on this batch. Yes, of course. And immediately he closed the bags and picked them up himself. Gornaricia barely could see as the Yucca crew grabbed the bags and took off, immediately looking forward to their immediate high. As it turns out, coffee had an effect similar to heroin with them, but it lasted much, much longer. This would put a crew out of commission for about a year, just those 2 small cases, as it would only take a scoop the size of a thimble to put them basically in a coma for over a week. Gornaricia sneered at the idea of this, and she simply turned her head forward and followed the humans in. Once she did, she was inside a room standing in front of a bulkhead door. There was no decoration or anything of that nature, no party or anything to welcome her on board that she could see. She simply stood there with the rest and waited for the rest of the humans to get back inside the ship. As they did, the door behind them shut, and she could hear the mechanical device of the umbilical being pulled away from the other ship. Then, with a quick burst of air, the door opened inside the ship. But as they walked through, the humans simply reached up and began removing their helmets. She looked over, and everything was bulky and utilitarian. There was no anything there. The color was, as the humans would eventually say, industrial chic. They seemed to find this funny, but she did not. It was depressing. She looked over, and everything had its own compartment. Everything was laid out specifically and tactically for certain uses. As she looked, the humans took off their bulky suits and simply hung them up next to a plate that had different symbols on it. She would find out later that these actually had their names on them. That way they could find their suit immediately. Next to it was also another locker that had other personal effects. This seemed to be rather complex and also very simple at the same time. The word that eventually came to mind was efficient. Eventually, the captain, a tall man who simply loomed over her, walked past and said, "This way, please." They walked down several corridors, taking several turns, and eventually entered an area that had a somewhat pleasant smell. As the door opened, they saw that there was all the crew, except for a few of them, of course, inside the area, all of them standing there, as the captain introduced Gornetia to them. She was surprised at this. Though there was not any type of giant parade or anything, she was surprised that the humans did have a small celebration and a get-together. They simply introduced themselves, each to her, but she was having difficulty remembering their names, as they were such strange things as Kyle, Bill, Lisa, Henry, Isaac, Luke. It was all strange. Even the female next to her, she would learn, is the name Julia. She was confused as all hell because everyone simply gave them her name. She would voice this during their little get-together, and everyone told her, "Oh, don't worry, you'll learn everyone eventually." They were surprisingly, affectionate. They brought her all sorts of drinks and all sorts of different foodstuffs, many of which were changed a little bit to help Gornetia develop a taste for human cuisine. As the fact of the matter is, they were not allowed to use certain items. Unfortunately, a few people did complain, and she did inquire on why they were complaining. They were asking why there was no spice in something they called buffalo wings. Gornetia was confused. Spice? It smells spicy to me. She reached one over with her slightly clawed hand, picked it up, and she could feel just a little bit of spice against her skin. She sniffed it. Seemed spicy to me. And she simply bit into it before anyone could tell her not to. She just looked around, strange, and then stripped the meat off the bone. One of the men simply said, "Wow, I'm glad you're not just an herbivore." She simply stated back, "Why would I be an herbivore? You've seen my teeth. And what do you mean, hey, there's no spice?" Oh. At that point, Gornetia started sweating uncontrollably and reaching for any type of liquid to put down and waving onto her tongue as it started to lean out of her face. Her tongue reaching down about 7 inches to comparison to a human who could barely get maybe an inch out of their mouth was strange to see. She didn't wave it around like a dog, but simply seemed to scrape it a little bit as though she was trying to get all the capsaicin off. She was then informed that humans can deal with capsaicin very, very well. In fact, there's enough capsaicin in some of our meals to kill her. So she needs to make sure she knows what she's eating from here on out. As tears rolled down her eyes, she realized that they were not kidding. A few of them were holding on to different cuisine items that were very red, and she could smell the spice even though her tongue and her navel passages were just burning. It would be a few more minutes before she got over that, and thankfully they had something she didn't know about, something they called milk. This milk helped out a lot with the burning. She was simply told to slosh it around in her mouth for a while and then simply swallow it. The strong base would negate the strong acid, and they were right. It did work, eventually. After that whole debacle, she simply started talking with the crew again, although she had a strange suspicion why the males were simply looking not in her eyes, but in different areas of her body. She wondered if the males were attracted to her or simply just curious. She was curious as well, as many of the males had different type of hair on their face. Her species did not grow hair at all. She wanted to actually touch and pet it to see if it was as soft as it looked. Many of the females especially had long hair that stretched down their back, and eventually she had her curious take over for her, reached out and grabbed a ponytail, but unfortunately pulled it a little too hard and got slapped across the face because of it. One of the women there did not like having her ponytail grabbed, but was vain enough to not ever cut it off. Gonorrhea was actually surprised at such violence against her, but was also told that that can be rather painful if somebody grabs a hold of your hair and pulls. She was surprised at the comment that she still did not understand was given, "If you're going to pull my hair, at least slap my ass first," which got the entire crowd to laugh and seemingly knock all sorts of tension out of the air. Gonorrhea was confused and wanted to know context, and the one she had pulled her hair simply leaned forward and said, "I'll tell you later." With that, they continued with the party, and afterwards she was brought back to her room. Fortunately for her, she wouldn't be sharing a room with more than one person. She was told that inside one of these ships, space was precious, so that not everyone could have their own room, because if they were, there wouldn't be enough place to do more than stand and or sleep. You wouldn't be able to have your own bathroom or anything of that nature. She had to confirm what bathroom meant before they continued, and rightfully so, as she had been holding herself for at least a few hours. Thankfully for her, the human facility seemed to work just fine for her physiology. Though this knowledge would go through the crew a lot, as many of them had questions, but they would have to wait. Gonorrhea was exhausted, and her new roommate, Emily, was a very sweet young girl, quite short for a human, at least it seemed like. Definitely shorter than Gonorrhea, who stood, by the human standard, just under 2 meters. Actually, 1.8 meters tall, which, as she was told, is tall for a human female. This is something that Gonorrhea didn't think twice of until her roommate simply said, "And I know the boys around here love a tall chick. Hell, they'll climb you like a tree." Gonorrhea didn't understand, as her roommate seemed to giggle uncontrollably. A strange sound she would find out is just a light laughter, which is usually something that human females do when they're trying not to belly laugh out loud. She would learn laughter later, whether she wanted it or not. The next morning, Gonorrhea was shown around the ship and given a complete and total tour of just about every single space outside of anyone's personal space, that is. She was shown everything from stem to stern, dorsal to ventral, and was surprised at how efficiently the inside of each of these ships was set up. It actually did surprise her, and humans did not disappoint on the surprises, as it seemed as though there was a very jovial attitude in almost every single space. That is, until they got to a few of the maintenance crew that were dealing with an issue, many of them yelling for tools, other ones throwing the tools, others bouncing around, using 0G in that area to be able to maneuver themselves into different locations and ways that they could actually tighten down bolts, move different areas, swap out materials, and so on and so forth. They seemed to be angry as they cursed constantly at each other. Gonorrhea had to be told that this is just the way they act. Don't take it personal. Believe me, they'll let you know if it's going to be taken personal. Gonorrhea, confused, but let it go as she continued her tour. Eventually, she ended up back on the bridge where the captain would turn with that bushy beard of his and ask, "So, did you enjoy your tour?" Gonorrhea responded, "Yes, it was enlightening." "Good. Your station is over there." "My station? I'm actually going to work? I'm not just going to observe?" "Everyone works on this ship. You don't work, we send you back. Nobody freeloads here." "Freeloads? Gets to do nothing while everybody else works. And you just live off the backs of everyone else. That's called slavery." Oh, Slave Master is freeloader? Close enough. Anyways, there's your station. Your partner will brief you. Gonarishia sent over, and what she saw was actually surprising. She was going to help out with the engineering, making sure that all the power worked within the ship. She was surprised. Her partner, Ricky, sat right next to her. He looked over to her, didn't seem to smile, but seemed to look her up and down kind of suspiciously, low and slow. Each time he went up and down, she seemed to move just a little bit each time, as though to give him a better look. Gonarishia simply asked, "Is there an issue with my appearance?" Ricky simply responded, "No, I think we're going to get along well." From across the room, you could hear, "Don't do it. Just don't do it. You don't know what's going to happen." Ricky didn't even turn to look, but simply just raised his hand so that his palm was facing forward and his hand was in a very solid fist, and then simply raised the middle appendage for just a few seconds, and then brought it down to again a few light giggles around the bridge area. Gonarishia very quickly got to work and learned her job. She learned that it wasn't a very busy job, but a very important one. She would also have to do her due diligence in with the basic cleaning and maintenance. She would help out the maintenance crew, and she would also help out with all sorts of cleaning as well. It seemed that everyone took their turn. Although she did not like what the humans called swabbing. After about 28 days of this, the ship had gone on several different runs, moving several different pallets of equipment to other ships, also getting a resupply. On the second resupply, Gonarishia asked if she could put in for any type of special equipment or special foodstuffs. Everyone was surprised. They said, "Absolutely, go ahead," as they handed a data pad over to her. They switched it over to Galactic Commons so that she could read it and fill it out for herself. Immediately, she started filling out for certain items, certain things that made a few people worry. One in particular made everybody freeze. The captain had picked up the data pad, looked at it, and went, "Cigarettes? Are you high? Or are you just trying to be?" Everyone stopped and spun around. Everybody knew what was going on. Not only was coffee a very strong type of drug for the Yeka, but for Gonarishia and her race, nicotine was beyond addictive. In actuality, you're talking about a euphoric drug that is akin to taking about 20 or 30 pills of ecstasy. It is no telling what some of them would do once they got a hold of this. They only knew this because one of the emissaries that had gone to her home planet lit up a pipe inside his own hotel room. And when the maid came in to clean, and also those who brought the room service, they immediately started acting strange, to the point where one of them actually went downstairs, punched their boss in the face, and when he was on the ground started kicking the crap out of him, and then simply walked out after stripping off their clothes. This was why nicotine was not something that was allowed inside that ship. It was immediately flagged, and Gonarishia had to go without. Although her other requests were easy to fill out. Corn chips and things of that nature. Though she wanted to try something that surprised everybody. She wanted to taste a cricket. We didn't know why, but it turned out she meant to say cracker, not cricket, as everybody was disgusted at her trying to actually eat a live cricket. She wasn't even insectoid in nature. She was more reptilian, if you really want to get down to it. But she looked so human in comparison that most of us just figured it out. Eventually, when it came down to the final month that Gonarishia was going to be there, she sat down with many of the crew during their dinner break, which is usually a long sit-down dinner with everyone, so they could, as they like to call, shoot the excrement. She still wasn't fully understanding on that one, but regardless, she asked the one question that had truly been burning, but she had been hesitant to ask. Why is it human ships are so ugly? This made everybody in the room stop their conversation, turn and look at her. Are you calling our girl ugly? Well, no, I didn't mean to offend, but relax. With that, Ricky, the one that had been sitting next to her, simply put his hand on her hand to try and calm her down, as she looked like she was afraid, like the humans were going to jump on her and eat her or something. He looked into her eyes and just went, "Don't worry. We're not taking it personal." With that, the captain simply turned and said, "It's not that our ships are ugly. We just don't care about aesthetics. You're in space. What the hell do we need to be aerodynamic for? Why would we need swim fins? Why would we need rounding armor when sloping armor works just fine? Why would we need all that extra garbage on this ship?" Gornaricia really didn't have an answer besides one. Beauty in space. Everyone paused, looked at each other, and then began to laugh uncontrollably. Beauty in space. Okay, what the, really? You want beauty in space? Follow me. She got up. Her, Ricky, Amanda, and a few other folks. They went over to the observation deck. They said, "Look up." Gornaricia looked into the darkness of space. She could see a nebula off in the distance. There's beauty out there. You just have to see it. Gornaricia looked at him confused. Ricky simply said, "Don't worry, I'll show her. I know everyone's kind of running a little late right now, getting back to their posts. I'll take care of this." Since their shift had been over anyway, it was okay for her and Ricky to stay there. With just the two on the observation deck, they looked into the darkness of space at the stars, and Ricky tried to explain, if you look up at the vastness of space, the wonder of what could be out there beyond your own comprehension is just beautiful in and of itself. Gornaricia was hesitant to think this way, as everything in her mind had to be logical, had to understand. Then he simply pointed at the nebula. The nebula was actually closer than she realized. What neither of them had realized is that the captain had maneuvered the ship so that they could get a better view. Thankfully, the gravity control systems made it so they didn't feel the sudden shift of the ship itself. Ricky simply pointed up with his hands and said, "Look at that. Look at that. It is beautiful. You're looking at basically a flower in space." Now that is beauty. Not some artificial crap that somebody designed and then built. No. Something that naturally happens. It's not covered up. It's just there. Can you see? Gornaricia was a bit confused, but she could see the bright blue of the nebula itself. The bright blue along with a little bit of red. She didn't understand this. She was always concerned with arcs and turns and all sorts of different things that were on the ships, and that was to them what beauty was. As Gornaricia locked her eyes on the nebula, Ricky stepped closer and stood right next to her. Again, pointing to the nebula, he said, "Look at how the colors change, how they swirl. There's no rhyme or reason for this, beyond the torsion fields that we're still trying to map. And torsion fields constantly change. So this right here, the beauty in chaos, I'm sure you've heard of that. I know you're very logical people. But sometimes just looking into one's eyes can be beautiful." That's when Gornaricia realized that Ricky was looking right at her. His hand had slowly placed around what her abdomen would be. She turned to him and looked, and then he responded, "We don't care how our ships look as long as they're functional. We look for beauty in other places where it truly matters." With that, Gornaricia began to fluster out a type of blue onto her skin. Ricky understood this as her version of blushing. And with that, Gornaricia began to understand that humans were interesting not because of all their engineering prowess, not because of their friendly demeanor, but because of the way they look at the universe with such wonder, with such ideals, and with that, the opportunities out there were beautiful. At this point, Gornaricia looked up, and she could see the nebula was even closer, and she began to understand what Ricky had told her. The nebula truly was one of the many things out in space that held the beauty in the darkness. You simply had to look and see it. She simply stated, "There is much beauty in space." Ricky tightened his grip just a little and then simply said, "I see beauty in this ship too." Throughout the Sol sector, the ship Beyond the Rim had become kind of a running gag. It was more infamous than anything else. But on that ship, there was a single alien species that was there to analyze humanity so that we could become more friends. A Firtian female named Gornaricia had not only been there for the 1 month she was supposed to be, but she had extended her tour. A lot of people try to figure out this. Was this some sort of spy activity? Was she more interested in learning about us, learning anything she could use against us? However, rumors began to spread, and eventually the rumors were codified simply by her roommate, Emily, stating, "Yeah, she is in a kind of a relationship with Ricky." Ensign Richard Grayson had become physically involved with an alien female. Many of those inside the fleet laughed at the idea and then thought for a moment, maybe I should get one of my own. The fact that most of those in space were male was a side benefit for those that were interested in finding a boyfriend or husband very, very quickly, as the odds were very much in their favor. However, the idea that a human male was now intimate with a alien female tend to not go over well with much of the chain of command. They worried this would be a political issue, and yes, it was. It actually took Gornaricia contacting her government directly from the bridge of one of the humans, what they call frigates, for her to actually say that she was not being held under duress, and they were not doing anything to her that she did not welcome or enjoy. In fact, it was kind of strange to everyone there to watch her change to a simple shade of almost blue, her species' version of a flushed cheeks, as she blushed at the idea of them realizing that she had had intimate contact with an alien species. Many of them worried that this may come out to cause some sort of malformation of a child. But it was very quickly figured out by the medical staff on board that the DNA was far too different. The chances of them even conceiving were well past the 1 in 100 threshold that would make everybody feel more comfortable. However, they found out later when talking to the crew that this was going to be, a higher percentage chance than they thought. Every single one that they talked to said the same thing, how they simply turned into a room that one of them would be working, go to their quarters to ask them a question, and then suddenly say the phrase, "Oh, jeez, will you two lock the fucking door?" This made everyone seemingly chuckle, as what else could you do in that sort of situation? They were both interested in each other. One was much younger than the other. Gornaricia freaked out when she actually found out how old Ricky truly was. She didn't understand that humans, since they had discovered and started to work with zero-point energy, quantum flux fields and such, that humans didn't age, not in the way she understood. So Ricky was actually in his late 30s, even though he looked like he was a late teenager. Ricky told her that, well, this is the form that I wanted. I wanted to look young. I want to be in my prime. As he flexed his muscles, he knew that this was something Gornaricia enjoyed looking at, as the males on her planet were very, very lean and didn't have much muscle definition at all. In fact, it was more akin to being able to move, more flexibility, more ability with speed and things like that to show off the females, where humans, clearly it was power. With this, Gornaricia worried that her own species might go to war with the humans, and she did not want that, as it would mess up her life. But nothing happened for that. Instead, she was more worried about other species, as they began to be worried about this, as humans began to get a reputation around the galaxy of wanting to mate with anything. This suddenly made everybody think that the phrase that humans said when they were angry at another one, that said, mate you, suddenly seemed plausible. Is this what the humans truly meant? That they just wanted to mate with every species in the galaxy? This was deplorable to them. But eventually, with the reaching out of Gornaricia and of course the Yaka and any other of the species that have been working with humans, things seem to calm down. That is, except for one species. One species at the far end of the rim called the Tarekna. The Tarekna were, well, for lack of a better term, they were a very capitalistic species. But they were also extremely tribalistic, down to families, that is. The Tarekna did not like the fact that the humans not only had made peace with other species, but were willing to travel from their own sector into friendly sectors on a moment's notice to deliver goods, many times undercutting the Tarekna's prices. And the Tarekna did not like this. So they made plans. Unknown to those on top of the Beyond the Rim, that there was a storm on the horizon, a storm that none of them could see. The cargo ship Beyond the Rim was nothing special, at least Gornaricia didn't think so. She just figured it was just a ugly flying brick that humans all seemed to fly in. She had got a good look inside the frigate as she had got on there and saw that it was a little bit more luxurious, but still just the basic design. Bulkheads everywhere, things that they call knee knockers that she had to go through for some strange reason. But those were very rare now. She was told that is an old design, and the frigate itself was much older compared to the newer ones that came out. But she did find it interesting that the ship interior was laid out similarly, but definitely not the same. As they traveled around the stars delivering their cargo, a few times opening up the cargo bay after they landed and giving the approaching species one hell of an eyeful, Gornaricia, though she was very immodest, as her species was known as the immodest ones, well, Ricky seemed to take this to heart and kind of take part in that as well. Several times we would hear, "Great Maker, what are you two doing?" With that, the captain would discipline them both. Confining them to quarters wasn't very good, since they actually put their quarters together. Instead, they just gave them extra work to do. This seemed to wear them out just a little bit more, which kept things under wraps a little more. However, as they reached several sectors out, 4 sectors beyond the Sol sector itself, this is well into alien territory, The Beyond the Rim saw something on their radar that made them very nervous. Something was coming. Something was coming at very high speed. It wasn't a missile. Missiles travel much, much faster than that. This was a ship, and it was heading towards them at an extremely fast rate. They seemed to be coming just directly at them, no turning. The Beyond the Rim called out. The captain got on the horn. Approaching spacecraft. Respond. No response. Approaching aircraft. This is the Beyond the Rim. We are a human cargo vessel. Respond. Nothing. With that, the human captain simply got a strange look on his face. Gonorishi had never seen this before. It was that of utter seriousness and determination. She looked around at each of them, and everyone who saw the captain's look simply either nodded or turned back to their stations, and suddenly began to open other panels that she had not even noticed before. They began to tap on these panels, and things began to happen around the ship. She suddenly heard over the command, "General quarters, general quarters." Something she had never heard before. She went to go ask what was going on, but even Ricky was busy. He was so focused on his work that even as Gonorishi asked him what the hell was going on, he didn't respond. He was hyper-focused on what he was doing. He was busy sending out a distress beacon, letting them know that they were most likely under attack. She didn't understand this. She couldn't read the human language. She could understand what they were saying, but she hadn't learned how to read it yet. She did understand that humans did use the color red as danger, so she knew something was seriously wrong. She went to ask another compartment with Emily, her former roommate, but Emily again was locked onto her system, making sure the engines were already spun up and everything, including backups, were getting ready to go. Gonorishi flipped around, left and right, looked around, and was scared at what was going on. She could see on the radar that the object was getting much, much closer, a lot faster than she would like. The only time a ship comes at them like this is that's attack attitude. They are coming in close to try and hit them with guns. Or they're going to try and ram them, depending on the species. This made Gonorishi very nervous, as she knew there was only one species that would ever try something this stupid. Well, at least she thought. To her surprise, the scanners indicate it was the Tereka ship. With this, the captain actually rolled his eyes. Oh shit, I knew this was coming. Gonorishi was confused. The captain simply said, "Hey, you," pointing at Gonorishi, "go strap in and hold on to something." Gonorishi was confused, but she did not hesitate, running over to one of the emergency seats and strapping in as tight as she could. Strapping in so tight that it made the harness that she used to wear look like kid gloves. With that, the captain got on the horn again. "Unidentified ship, we understand you are on attack attitude. If you continue to approach, we will have no choice but to defend ourselves." With that, they waited, and those few seconds passed very, very slowly. Then suddenly from the comms, "Energy spike! Evasive maneuvers!" Suddenly, the ship lurched in an odd direction. Gonorishi wasn't ready for it as she had her head slam into her own shoulder. It hurt a lot, but it was better than being crushed under her own weight. She was able to right herself just as the ship moved. She could see on the sensor that they had fired some sort of weapon at them. Some sort of weapon that whipped past them. She could actually feel the static electricity coming through the bulkhead. The captain tried to call one more time. "Unknown vessel. I'm going to pretend that was a mistake. You are going to identify yourself, right?" And with that, a Trekina voice came over. "Human? Humans, you will surrender your vessel. You no longer have communications with your own people. We have jammed your communications and help will not be coming. You'll surrender your ship along with the Fashun you have on board. And you will know that you will be held in our detainment for the rest of your lives. However, if you defy us, we will destroy you, and simply say it was a Yeka or a Fashan who had done it. So you have one choice. If you wish to survive, you will surrender to us." With that, the captain looked around the crew, flipped on the comms, and said, "I don't think so, asshole." He flipped his hand really quick, and with that, the engines cranked up to full, lurching the ship forward as hard as it could. A second later, Gonorisha can feel the ship tilting and turning. It was like the cargo bays had opened up. The inertia from opening cargo bays was enough to move the ship ever so slightly, and you get used to that feeling very quick. She couldn't figure out, are they trying to dump the cargo? What's going on? She looked over to one of the displays, and she couldn't believe what she saw. Suddenly, she saw turrets had pumped out of the ship. They were inside armored blisters that seemed to elevate themselves all of a sudden and expose the guns. With that, the guns began to blaze away as fast as they could. A mixture of energy and ballistic weapons came flying out at the ship that had just fired at them. The captain cranked us over towards him, and with that, they lurched again to one side, moving the ship immediately in the direction of those who were facing them, but not on a collision course. No, they were off just a little bit. And as they began to get closer and closer, the ship itself that they were firing on seemed to turn as buzzers went off. Energy spikes! And with that, the ship again lurched, this time dropping down so much that Gonorisha thought she was going to be launched out of her seat. She could feel again the static electricity of whatever was being fired at her had passed by the ship close enough that they had just barely missed. However, she realized by looking at the radar that they were extremely close. How close? Close enough that point defense systems were beginning to rip holes in the hull of that ship. They pierced it straight down the middle. They began to put designs into it. She looked over at the weapons station and she saw Johnny, the weapons specialist, smiling and laughing. She couldn't figure out what was going on. Confused, she couldn't bring words to her mouth. But the kicker was, Johnny seemed to know exactly where to fire. The ship that was facing them seemed to immediately go adrift. Its engines were still on, but it seemed like all the crew was done. Johnny continued to use his sensor to move the guns in a certain way. And with that, a few seconds later, it was over. Gonorisha asked, "Is it over?" The captain said, "Yeah, you can unbuckle now." She got up and ran over to Ricky just to see if he was okay. He was laughing as he looked at the screen. She couldn't figure out what was going on, but all the humans looked up at the screen and began to do deep laughs. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. With that, she looked up, but she couldn't figure out what she saw. But she would commit it to memory and figure out that he actually wrote, "Humans were here," across the side in a very slanted, one kind of fluid motion across. She didn't understand this. She knew humans had different languages, but she had rarely seen this outside what they call a signature. She was very, very confused. With that, of course, the jammer was let go. And as soon as the jammer was released, they received all sorts of messages that human space was being hit from all different areas. With that, you could collectively hear the entire crew go, "Oh, fuck." With that, the captain turned the ship immediately back towards the Sol sector, sent a probe forward with a message to those who were supposed to retrieve the cargo that they had to return due to unforeseen circumstances, and headed directly back to the Sol sector. As they got back a few jumps later, they saw that there was a battle all amongst the sector. Small pockets of fight was going on all over the place. The Beyond the Rim was not a fighting vessel. It was a cargo ship. The best it had was point defense weapons. If used correctly, they can be absolutely devastating, but not in a heavy gun battle. When you're talking about destroyers, frigates, and battleships wailing at each other from distances well beyond visual range. Hell, almost beyond sensor range. Not someplace you want a cargo ship to be. However, to keep from being targeted, they had to go dark. They immediately shut down as many systems as possible, and they began to shut down the engines and just simply drift in the direction of Earth. They knew eventually they would have to turn them back on to make course corrections, but only being seen for a few seconds, maybe a minute, was not enough for an enemy to get a lock on, get in position, and actually fire and keep the lock once they go dark again. Even if they did pack a few decoys. Gonarishi was amazed at this. How could this ugly little tub be able to do something like that? She did ask the question, and Ricky looked at her. You think this is something? Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. He turns to the captain. Permission to take her up to the deck, sir? Permission granted. They went back up to the viewing area, the observation deck on the dorsal side of the ship, and they looked out. Ricky had grabbed a strange device, something he called binoculars. Gonarishi was confused at this. She thought nuclear meant something was very bad, but she didn't worry about it too much, as Ricky held it in his hand, seemingly gingerly. Eventually, when they got up to the observation deck, he looked amongst the stars, looking for a small pocket of sparks and strange energy waves as they went across. He raised the device to his eyes, looked over, and then extended the front out as far as it would go. Ah, there they are, he said. He handed them over to Gonarishi. He showed her how to adjust it to her face, and he pointed out where those were. Gonarishi didn't know what she was going to look at. She knew this was a battle going on. What the hell was going on? What was she going to see? It wasn't in the nebula. What the hell? She looked over and she could see a single human ship. Then she moved a little bit and realized that if she adjusted her point of view, she could see several. They seemed to be lined up in a certain formation. 1, 2, 3 of them, in a strange triangular pattern. They seemed to be moving, adjusting their location in space ever so slightly. And every few seconds, something would whip past them, some sort of energy beam, some sort of projectile. If any type of missile or torpedo got close, they were immediately blasted by the point defense systems. It was an impressive display, but it wasn't just that. The flying brick she was looking at was seemingly built in sections, with smaller sections to the seemingly front of the ship. She couldn't figure out why, until she looked and saw that several weapons suddenly fired at the same time. They didn't have to worry about hitting each other or having to adjust where the turrets were. They simply fired in the same direction. Then suddenly she saw something truly amazing as the front of the ship began to almost glow for a second, sparking a little bit in the darkness of space, and then all of a sudden something blasted out the front. Was that projectile? Was that energy? What was that? She was confused. How could a frying brick, one of these disgustingly ugly ships, pack so much firepower? She looked as close as she can at one of them, and she saw that it was completely covered in weapons. It was like one of the type of species she has on her planet called a Zigna. The humans call them similar to porcupines, just covered with all sorts of weapons. As some of the missiles tried to come in through the flanks, they were simply shot to pieces by the point defense systems, or other missiles were sent out to hit them. It was an amazing dance that she saw in space. She watched for several minutes, and eventually she pulled the binoculars down. And without turning away from the sight she could see, she asked Ricky, "How could you build warships like that so quickly? I've never seen anything like this with all the weapons hanging out." Ricky was confused, but he understood what she meant. "Oh, no, my dear. He reached his hand around her shoulder and pulled her in a little closer. No. Understand that those ships in particular, those are designed specifically for combat. The fact that they don't put their weapons out until battle starts is more to protect the weapon systems. Weapon systems, as you know, are very, very, very fragile. If they hit, they're completely useless, even if they don't explode. But I thought all you made were flying bricks. Ricky kind of looked at her sideways a little bit as she continued to look out, and he said, well, yeah, I guess by your way, we do make flying bricks. But our flying bricks can bring one hell of a lot of fun to the party. With that, she looked over to where the ships were firing at and saw several of the Trekna ships being destroyed as their internal atmospheres seemed to blow up in a massive fireball, a mix of red and greens. She seemed put back at this. As she looked a little closer, and then she tried to raise the binoculars to look close, Ricky took the binos and pushed them down. No. You don't want to see that. Trust me. He looked over, and she was extremely sad at what she was seeing. He simply put his hand behind her head, twisted her around, and then put her head in his shoulder. This was a universal sign that had come to fruition. A simple holding, and one Gonoritia had come to appreciate beyond all other attempts at intimacy. It was at this point that they realized that the ship had started up again and would have to do some course corrections, and they worried about what was going on, so immediately they ran down back to the bridge to take up their stations again. But by the time they got to their stations, the course correction was over and they had gone dark again. When the battle was over, Gonoritia had to send her next month's report. Her species, the Fursunin, were very interested to know how the humans had stopped a full-on invasion and possible annihilation in their sector. Gonoritia filled out her report at what she had seen, and to end it, she actually wanted to say what Ricky said about bringing a lot of fun to the party, but she believed that her own species would not understand. But then she thought about it. She realized that there was the duality of man that Ricky had told her about a long time ago, and decided to translate an old human phrase into their own language. The phrase was, "If you want peace, prepare for war." And all the human flying bricks were ready to do just that. And by the time the report had actually gotten back to her people, the Trekna had lost almost all of their contracts with almost every single other species in the known galaxy. Those that were still working with them were usually doing things black market style and getting a lot of discounts, as the Trekna would have a long time before they were able to resolve any issues and rebuild any reputation they might still maintain. However, they are never going to lose the stigma of being bitch-slapped in the timeout corner by a bunch of angry, hairless monkeys. After the galactic argument with the Trekna, where they decided to go into the Sol sector to take it over and the humans replied with, "Well, here's your ass," things seemed to calm down for a long time. The crew of Beyond the Rim were stuck bringing cargo back and forth to different colonies and just outside of Sol sector. Along with that, they began to reach into other sectors that the humans had as well. The humans seemed to be expanding, and surprisingly, Garanesha got a chance to see how the humans actually colonize a planet. She was amazed by this. She wanted to see a human colonization ship, as they were things of legend. Not because people didn't know what they did, but simply because you never see one. The humans almost kept it completely a secret. The fact that they could land one of these ships on a planet was amazing by itself, but the fact that they could use this ship to actually create life, create a habitable planet within the course of a single human rotation around its sun, was just unbelievable. So the fact that she was going to be chosen, along with her ship, to escort the ship used for colonization and terraforming, the Terran United Terraforming Ship 7, TUTF-7, was a gigantic brick. Gornaricia was getting very tired of the fact that there was absolutely zero aesthetics on even this ship. Something so important to the Terran United that she couldn't believe it. It was simply a block. No discernible engines, as she couldn't understand which end was the bow and which end was the stern. But it was very simple to see which one was the dorsal and which one was the ventral side. As once you got on the ventral side, you could actually see landing struts. Those were easily set into the hull of the ship themselves, but it was very easy to see them. With that, they took a little bit of a tour outside the ship as they were explained what would happen. And what would happen simply made Gornaricia's jaw lower down more and more and more as she realized what was going on. With that, Ricky thought it was funny as he slowly moved his hand to the bottom of her jaw and closed her mouth, to the point she almost bit her tongue. Emily thought it was funny seeing this movement, and was still a little peeved that she had to move out of her room as Ricky had moved in with Gornaricia. However, she was more than willing to giggle at the whole idea of those two living together, especially since she only moved next door, and let's face it, you can still hear things through the bulkhead. Regardless of that, they simply lined up with several other ships that were going to be escorting the terraforming ship. And eventually, it began to spin up its engines, and soon enough it would be at its destination. It was a fairly short trip as far as technology FTL was concerned, and soon they were above a barren rock, a desolate place that seemingly was full of nothing but dark browns, reds, but still had small rivers, very small. You had to look in very close. You could see that at some point the atmosphere was just enough to produce rain. And then each of these small riverbeds would flood down in and bring some sort of a semblance to life. Gornaricia reviewed all the videos of this planet and realized that even though water came down, there was no anything else there. The entirety of the planet was dead. Though it produced water, it did not even produce bacteria. It was too hot, then too cold, then too hot again, far too fast for anything to survive. Down to the smallest microorganism, nothing was there. She wondered if the humans' engineering could possibly do anything to this planet. And this planet was surprisingly close to Gornaricia's home sector. It was only a single jump away. She was surprised. Could the humans really do this to a planet that, after she reviewed her notes, her own government had looked through it, had scaled it, had checked everything, but believed that it was too hostile an environment, as it was basically an acid-filled washing machine as well. She was confused. How did the humans plan on taking care of this? She was informed that the outside of the ship was specially coated every single time it went to a planet. Each of these coatings had to be individually done and put on at least 6 times to make sure the ship did not fall apart just by descending onto this planet. As the Beyond the Rim stayed above the atmosphere, they watched as, with amazement, the terraforming ship, this massive brick that must have been almost a kilometer long and 1/4 kilometer wide, slowly make its way down to the planet. She watched on the sensors as there was a slight shudder to the planet itself. With this much mass entering its atmosphere, there was going to be a slight movement in the way the planet operated. However, it was well known that once one of these ships leaves, the planet would only take a few human months to actually adjust itself back to the way it was. But that was after they had done what they were going to do. She still sat there and watched the show, almost unblinking, to the point where Ricky had to bring her a drink to make sure that she didn't dehydrate herself, as she watched as the ship again lowered itself without retro engines at all. She did inquire about this, and she was told that if they used any type of fusion reaction engine, the nozzles would simply melt off and the reaction engine would start tearing itself apart and then hit critical mass and explode. So yeah, they can't use them. However, the gravimetric system worked just fine. Though they needed a very robust system for a ship this large, they realized it can be done. And to Gonoricia's absolute shock, as she watched, she heard an alarm go off. There was another jump coming in. Several, actually, as other terraforming ships came in. This was the TUTF-7 she was watching, but now the 3, the 4, and the 8 are all showing up. Not only that, but they were expecting at least 2 more. It was then that she finally realized how large a scale of an operation it was to terraform the planet. She realized, and she would have to note this in her report, that the humans don't just use one ship. Everyone believed there was just one ship, because as they did a flyby, each of the ships were spaced out so much that you could only see one, and you would have to see it visually because of what happened next. As the ship slowly made it down, she could see that it lowered some of its landing struts so it could land softly, but as it did, the landing struts retracted inside so that it laid on its belly on the surface. She saw there was some sort of strange chemical reaction coming from the skin of the ship along with that of the surface touching each other. But that is not what made her totally shocked. Suddenly, vents opened up on all sides of the ship and vented some sort of atmosphere onto the planet. It sprayed a strange white mist that seemed to build up into a massive cloud. This cloud was incredibly dense and seemed to be mixing in with the local atmosphere as it began to billow up like some sort of large marshmallow all around the ship. Suddenly, she could see the outer edge starting to weave its way into the atmosphere, and then it suddenly started to disperse out across the land as though it was a flood reaching out. And then the same plume began to lift and fill the air. The vents did not stop. They continued to pump this same chemical into the air, seemingly forcing it out of the ship, so much so that she couldn't understand. She was looking at the viewer so closely now as she tried to get a better view, but the Beyond the Rim had to stay in geosynchronous orbit to watch over everything and bring any materials that they might need. But they had to wait until the call. Totally amazed as the gas continued to billow out for over 15 minutes. It filled up the area. She looked over at one of the other ships that had just landed, and it was doing the same thing. She wondered if around the planet the other terraforming ships were doing this. They began to do something to the atmosphere. And it was then that the monitor began to flicker. It began to flicker a lot. She moved away and looked out the viewing area, and she could see flashes of light. She screamed, "They are under attack! They are under attack!" Everyone laughed. "You never seen lightning before?" Surprisingly, no, she hadn't. She had heard about it. A sudden burst of electrons that was not common around any of the planets that her people had. It actually was scary to her. She began to tremble at the idea. As she looked on, it was told how much voltage, how many gigawatts are being used. And when she calculated how much, she began to be truly afraid. She believed that the metal ship that was down there would be a perfect conductor, and yet this was all part of it. They used the conductivity of the surface and of the ship itself to siphon in all of that electricity. It would go into the ship, down into the surface, and cause a reaction. They were trying to force a reaction on the planet itself and in it as well. Terraforming was more than just throwing seeds on the ground or pumping some O3 into the air. No, it was a very complex process. And each planet would be different. And for this planet in particular, they need to shock the living crap out of the mantle, causing it to shimmy and shake and crack and cause some sort of volcanic explosion. She would find out later that the volcanic explosion was needed specifically to cause volcanic ash into the atmosphere. When the volcanic ash entered the atmosphere, the entire surface of the planet was covered in a strange fog. This fog produced all sorts of lightning, and she was told this would cause precipitation. The precipitation would come down in massive quantities. This would quell any ash that was in the air, making the air unbreathable, covering the area in a very, very fertile layer of topsoil, soil required for plants to grow. This was a very dangerous thing to do, as the volcanic areas were not perfect. They weren't sure if a volcanic area would be directly under the ship, if somehow the tectonic plates would shift, and then suddenly the ship itself would have to lift off before ending up being its own Pompeii. However, that was very rare, and only one terraforming ship had ever been lost. In fact, it was still on the planet that it terraformed. It was left there as a memorial, as the planet itself may have been angry when it took the ship, but now is pulling down the ship with all its flora and fauna, making nests, and of course leaving waste on it, which burns away at the metal, along with the flora that seems to grow all over it. Gornaricia thought about this, and was worried that she would see this ship get ripped apart like that one as well, but no. She watched in amazement. It seemed like every day she would go and watch for hours on end when she wasn't on duty, just to see the differences. But the transition at this point was, though fast as far as terraforming, was slow compared to one who would watch it every day. She knew it would take almost a human month before it was ready for anything to happen. However, during this time, the Beyond the Rim had another mission. They had to go into the nearby nebula and collect large ice chunks. These ice chunks would be quite literally dropped onto the planet. As they went through the atmosphere, the new atmosphere that was being built, they would burn up, explode, and spray water everywhere. These ice chunks would be the new rivers and lakes. It would take a long time before there would be any semblance of an ocean, but this would end up being a green world, not a blue one. It was very rare to ever find a true blue planet. It was even more rare to find a blue planet with mammalians in charge. All in all, by the end of the month, she could see the very top of the ship that they were watching as they went by and dropped another several hundred metric tons worth of ice onto the planet. She saw it rip into the atmosphere, and originally she saw it simply tumble down and crash on the planet. But now, as the atmosphere was building up, they would burn in and explode in a massive fireworks display. Most of the crew wanted to sit and watch, and it was amazing to watch a simply random fireworks display. More often than not, one of the crew would choose one of the Earth's songs to play over the explosions. And if they were lucky, the explosions would line up with the beat of what they called a drum. It was something else to see. By the end of 2 months, you could see at least half of the top of the ship, and you could see, again, the atmosphere begin to get denser and denser as the horizon became more and more pronounced. This showed that there was an atmosphere now. The atmosphere she could see on the very edge was turning a shade of blue instead of the normal white of a very thin one. She was amazed at this. Humans had spent so much time, so much resources, and so much research to figure out a way to terraform this planet, and it was working. She sent her reports back, and several times her own ships would come in just to see what was going on. As it was very close to their own sector, they were worried that the humans might be building some sort of base, but very quickly realized that they were simply terraforming a new planet to live on. This planet didn't even have a name yet, and would not be christened a name until later on, not until everything was finished. At the end of 3.5 months, Gornaricia could finally see the ground. There was a very light mist on the ground, as they dropped another round of ice, but this would be the last time they dropped because the next phase was about to begin. She was told, just watch, this is going to be fun. They couldn't land on the planet just yet, as it would be dangerous for what was going to happen next. She looked really close and she could see parts of the ship begin to open up. She couldn't see anything near the ship, but parts of it just seemed to open bay doors on the side, and also on the dorsal section seemed to be something else was coming out, almost like lasers were pointing out. It was odd. Gonoricia asked Ricky, "Are they going to shoot something?" Ricky went into hysterics so much that he said he almost pissed his pants. Emily was also rolling on the ground and was holding on to the bottom of her trousers as she ran into the next room. Gonoricia was confused and simply watched as suddenly a strange green liquid was being sprayed out. These were not lasers. These were hoses with a high-pressure nozzle attached to them, as they sprayed back and forth out from the ship. Gonoricia could see there was just a slight hint of a breeze, as she could see the spray was not going fully out, but simply got arced in some directions. She looked closer and closer and realized that yes, they were spraying some sort of almost plant matter all over the place. She didn't understand, but the sprayers just continued more and more and more until there was a very thick layer of them on the surface. Now, the layer of this was not only on top of a very, very fertile piece of property, even though a very thin one, but it was also getting the random precipitation that had come from them changing the atmosphere. She was absolutely astounded. What did they spray? She didn't have to wait too long, as only a few days later she could see that even though the very top layer had gone brown, now it had begun to sprout a lot of green. Within a week, the whole area had turned completely green and was spreading out very, very quickly. Whatever was there was just reaching out extremely fast. She wondered if it was algae, and she was told it was simple grass. She didn't know what this was. She was informed that was a simple type of flora that was common around all of Earth. But this grass was chosen specific for this planet. It would be a bit more broad-leafed than what was normally on Earth, as they would be catching much more of their own star nearby. They needed this. They needed this to be able to feed the animals that would eat it, as the humans needed something to chew on themselves and would be eating the animals eating the grass. A strange way, but then again, she was omnivorous as well, and realized that they would need to be able to do this. It was less than a week where she received a shock. Coming into the viewing area, she looked over and she thought something was moving outside the ship. Sure enough, as she looked close through the viewports, she could see there was something in fact moving. Running down to get some sort of telescopic lens, she looked over and she could see movement. Though still in suits, humans were outside of the ship. Not only that, but they were outside with other vehicles. These vehicles were not being degraded at all. The atmosphere had been adjusted so much that she couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was less than a month, and humans had done it. Though they couldn't go without suits yet, they had terraformed a planet good enough that they could bring vehicles down. And with that, she was absolutely floored, but would be more literally floored, as the Beyond the Rim suddenly turned on its engines and began to bank its way so it could enter the atmosphere. Picking herself up off the floor, as she was not ready for the adjustment, she could hear the captain, "Sorry about that. We just got word that we have to be on the surface pronto. They need our supplies. Just strap into something. This is going to get a little bumpy." Gonoricia ran down to her station and immediately began to strap in. She watched as the Beyond the Rim simply went down towards the surface and then landed less than a kilometer away from the ship. She wondered if she could get out of her own ship to go and see what was going on, but she was told she needed an encounter suit, as the surrounding area might be enough that vehicles can handle, but skin, scale, or feathers would not do very well at all after about 10 minutes. However, what would be even worse would be your eyes. It would be like opening your eyes in a pool that has been overly chlorinated. Though they could be healed, the resulting burning sensation for the next 2 days was not something you want to do with. All in all, Gornaricia was able to walk out in her suit. She drove one of the vehicles over, delivering supplies to the ship. Those that were from the ship were happy to see this, as they were starting to run low on food. They looked over at her and were surprised to see one of her own kind. One was asking, "Is that a Frishun?" Ricky simply nodded. And one pointed, "You're the one who's... You had heard it... Holy crap, I didn't know that we were going to find a guy who was..." With that, he was swatted upside the back of the head by one next to him. It's like, "Dude, have some common sense. That's their own private matter." Ricky kind of looked and nodded as a way of saying thanks to the one who swatted his friend to make him shut up. Then the guy looked at him, and Ricky could see just a quick thumbs up and a grin, as in, "Cool, dude." With that, Gornaricia was still amazed. Grass was actually growing, though not very well at this point. She realized it would take some time for the planet to do what it has to do before it's able to actually maintain itself. However, at the end of the month, she realized that the humans could walk around without suits, though they still kept goggles on to protect their eyes. Many of them still have respirators around to make sure that their lungs don't get damaged. However, it was still amazing. She couldn't believe this giant flying brick, along with about 4 or 5 others, were able to do this. In another 2 weeks, they would be removing this brick from the surface, and the planet itself would be abandoned except for a few stations to watch over. And they were simply amazed. The humans had done what her own people had believed to be impossible. They looked around and could see that the planet was turning green. Off in the distance, you could see that small rivers, what humans called brooks or creeks, or what other goofy name they could come up with, were beginning to move freely all year. The planet itself was very similar to that of Earth as far as its rotation around the star. The star was a little older, but still, it was close enough to Earth that this would make a new habitat for humans with not an issue, given just a few more weeks of time, and Gornaricia was absolutely astounded. When Gornaricia gave her report as the TUTF-7 finally lifted off the planet, seemingly trying to shake off the dirt and the flora that had basically just built up on the sides and on the bottom of the ship, Gornaricia went to make her report to her own government. They were all amazed, as they had no way of disproving what she had said, that the humans were not only going around in the ugliest damn ships they had ever seen, but the ugliest damn ships they ever seen kicked the crap out of a species that has been spacefaring for another 300 years, easily more than humans have been. Along with that, they have the technology to terraform planets with a flying brick. Gornaricia still had trouble keeping her emotions in check as she began to put all of this into her report. With this, she only got one response. From her government came one question. You think they'd be willing to share? Gornaricia laughed at this hysterically, to the point where she thought she was going to actually pee herself, which would be even worse since she doesn't wear pants. Then again, she suddenly doubled over in pain. She started to screech in pain. What the hell was going on? She thought to herself. She yelled so much that Emily came in and saw Gornaricia was in extreme pain. Surprisingly, Emily just grabbed her, picked her up with her bare hands, and carried her over her shoulders straight into the medical facility. She wouldn't, and everybody was around trying to figure out what was wrong. Okay, we can't lose our alien ambassador here. This could be bad. Even the captain came down to see what the hell was going on. But as he came in, he saw the medical staff looking over several screens, just cursing. With that, he went over, grabbed it out of the medical examiner's hands, and simply said, "Are you sure? Tell me you're sure." They all looked and nodded. That's when Ricky came in, panting as he had sprinted from the bridge straight into the medical bay, and looked over, and the captain held up the screens, goes, "Congratulations." Rick and Gorna, which became the new nickname for her since Gornaricia was a very long name to pronounce by human standards, became a very hot topic to any ears that heard them, especially since what's happening shouldn't be possible. But then again, many would mention that life finds a way. Gorna was in fact creating an egg and would theoretically soon lay it. The pain she was feeling that made her double over was due to the unusual size of the egg itself. It was over 10% larger than it should be, and once this information reached her government, they would immediately send a specialty. Gorna herself was immediately taken off duty, and the Beyond the Rim was made immediately for the nearest hospital station or ship that had adequate facilities. The closest one to where they were at that moment was in the humans' known space stations, at least the few that still remained. On the way, the word had spread about the incident. Every species that found out that a human may be able to reproduce with a Furtian, well, this is unprecedented, and this is something every species wants to know about. With the Beyond the Rim well outside human territory at this point, it was seemingly undefended. Every criminal / pirate that realized that this mother and or child will be worth a hell of a lot of money made best speed. Yet no one wanted to face off against the humans. They remember what the humans did during their previous conflict. Ghastly was the word used, so they needed to be smart. Waiting near one of the jump nodes, a multitude of ships just waited there. They didn't communicate with each other, but none of them had any illusions on why they were there. The Beyond the Rim jumped in and was immediately surrounded. As even more ships arrived, the blockade became thicker, too thick to pierce through at that point. The comms were immediately jammed, packed with orders for the Beyond the Rim to surrender, but the captain had other ideas. Immediately, he deployed the weapons, and he told his helmsman, "Don't you dare fucking stop." The entire bridge crew could make out the plethora of calls to surrender the Furtian female and her mate. The response was simple: come and get them. No one wanted to risk the mother, as she was the prize, but they had to do something as the Beyond the Rim began blasting away with every weapon system it had. This is the first time most of them have actually seen human firepower, and for many, it would be their last. Human weapon systems ran hot as ships tried to take out the weapon systems themselves and use magnetic grapplers to bound themselves to the ship and attempt to board it. All this while being shot up and fighting off others trying to do the same thing, all while the Beyond the Rim was fighting and tearing all the ships apart, cutting them into pieces if necessary. Think of it as the universe's worst game of King of the Hill. In a very short time, the ship is fighting the engines of a ship that has its magnetic grapplers on it. The weapon systems, still functional, are spraying in all directions trying to keep all the others back, dragging along with it several cables that have been ripped off and are now behind it as it tries to accelerate, as they then had their cables somewhat cut, but there's a trick to that. Realizing they couldn't just cut the cables directly with their weapons, many of them constantly said, "Fucking pirates!" And in the melee, the Rim loses all of its weapon systems. This leaves it vulnerable as being held by the grapplers. The pirates have beaten each other for the prize so much that only one other ship remains. From the outside, it actually looks worse than the Beyond the Rim, so much so that both ships are now basically adrift. With no way to relieve the grapplers, the ships slowly drift around each other. Eventually, the cables from the grapples pull taut and draw the ships into each other. The impact would send all those inside flying in unknown directions. With the main engines offline, the crew only really has life support inside. They do have a few other pieces, but not many. Gorna, like so many others, is getting sick from all the changes of motion and spin. With this being a human ship, they can use the few maneuvering thrusters, but they need to get those Xenos off their back somehow. On the bridge, they could hear Ricky's voice as he called for the captain. Still trying to get main power online, the captain responded with, "What?" Ricky, standing next to an airlock with a suit, actually said, "Sir, permission to leave the ship." "Why? What for?" the captain said. Ricky responded, "To say hi to our friends and get there and cut us free." "Permission granted," the captain said. Going through the airlock, Ricky made sure his tools are secured, his magnetic boots are functioning, and then he was able to step out with the outer pressure doors opening. Walking across the hall, he could see the massive damage. In every direction, ships of all sizes and shapes drifted silently in the void. Looking down at his ship, he could see the beating the hull had taken. The ship may be modular, but it might just actually be totaled out with all this damage. Only one weapon seems still functional, but its targeting sensor is just gone. Blown off or knocked off, something is just not there. The comms were in rough shape, and the engines are basically being held together with little bits of wire and good intentions. As he walked across, he can see the pirate ship's hulk coming back after being pulled taut again. Ricky got into position as he could see the others exiting the airlock. Looking at them, Ricky could see tools for fixing the relay and maybe the engines if they're lucky. Real lucky. None of them bothered to get a pack on, as it would take them another hour or so to dig them out of the crushed compartment they were in, which meant no actual spacewalking. They lose grip on the hull, and they will drift in the void until they just run out of air. Ricky saw the ship coming back in, and he prepped himself as the pirate ship got closer and closer. He would have to time this just right. Just as the ship hit his, Ricky turned off his lock and jumped, twisting his way so that his boots touched the enemy hull as he flipped and then hit the lock. And with that, he found himself flipping upwards really, really hard as the ship struck again. With his feet lacking down to the hull, he smacked the back of his helmet before bouncing back up like he was a human-sized weeble wobble. Shaking off the impact and checking to make sure there was no damage, he got to work. The dozen high tensile wires are scattered all over the pirate ship. Moving each one, he used a device called a monomolecular cutter. It is an absolutely wonderful cutting tool, provided the item he's cutting isn't made of a certain heat-resistant material. As it turns out, the cables have this strange material in them, at least for the first few hundred feet. This would not stop Ricky, though. It would just slow him down. As you see, each cable is made of this material, so it can't simply be blasted. Energy weapons don't work. Energy-based tools don't work. And if you try to take the magnetic coupling off, well, you're in for a shock. However, once you get towards the end of the cable, you can actually sever the device holding it. So you'd end up just dragging all these long pieces of cable around until you're able to shed them off. Walking around, he severed each of the cables one by one. He had to move as the ships would collide 4 more times before he's done, cursing the entire way. Fucking pirates! I hate pirates! He wished he could just cut the ends attached to the ship. It is well noted that these are reinforced to withstand cannon fire. The cutter just doesn't work as he looked at it, kind of cursing at the device that seemed to work as soon as he got it into the enemy's hull and ripped the mechanism out that held the cable. But it would take time. And eventually, he got to the last one. As he was severing the last cable, he knew what he had to do. As the last mechanism broke away from the pirate ship, Ricky squatted down, turned off his magnetic lock, jumped as hard as he can, pushing his tools up towards his own ship. The resulting force gets him to fly at his ship. Though the others are sitting there waiting for him, trying to catch him will get them actually crushed. So they would have to be around him and try to actually tackle him when he hits the hull. Inside, Gorna is actually sitting next to the engineer working on the engines itself. As she hands the engineer the next tool he asked for, they both hear Ricky as he hits the hull with a very loud clunk. They both look up to where the noise came from before the engineer says, "You know, for a brick, he flew pretty good." This made her laugh, and laugh even harder, thinking about what they call human ships. By the time the repair crew got inside, a large jump arrived. At first, they thought, oh shit, more pirates. Then a voice came over the comms. "This is Captain Pope of the human cruiser Horizon's Light. Beyond the Rim, are you in need of assistance?" The response was simple. "All we can get." This made the crew laugh, but they were glad to actually see friendly ships for once. It would take a long while to attach the ship so that they could travel to human space. As they do, Gorna looked out the porthole to see their saviors. When she first arrived on this detail, she thought to herself how human ships were just the ugliest damn things in space. Now, she can't think of anything more beautiful than that giant brick outside. The jump to human space was not pleasant, as the extra mass meant that things would be a bit bumpy. The crew of both human ships surprised Gorna as she saw them nonchalantly deal with this issue like it was commonplace. What made her actually enjoy the trip and constantly snicker even though she kept saying it was nothing, was hearing the humans talk during all this. Now, to her ears, human talk was always kind of weird. However, now, hearing humans talk while they're being chucked around was being kind of funny to her. Once they reached human-held space, the two ships came out FTL and settled as more ships seemed to arrive. This included several human warships, one so large with so many large weapons, so many secondary weapons, and just plastered with blisters that protected the point defense cannons that Gorna felt a cold shiver run down her spine at the thought. Yet her fears went away. As she looked over to the center of the formation, there was a very large Firtian ship. This ship stood out due to its very, shall we say, flamboyant design. Gorna could see the royal crest actually on the bow, meaning that this was actually one of the royal family's personal ships. It is a long process to get the shuttles attached to clear out the crew from Beyond the Rim. This is required for what was going to happen next. However, the shuttles could not dock due to the insane multitude of cables that were still attached and randomly stuck to the hull. Not to mention that, but the mechanisms that had to be cut off the pirate ships themselves were basically giant bludgeons constantly coming back. The shuttles don't really have thick hulls as a standard ship, so they have to use the much smaller bay to get into to load everybody up. This meant they had to use smaller shuttles, and it just took much longer. Once everybody was out and the engines are shut down, systems are completely shut off, everybody gets ready as an inverse repulse is charged and a burst is sent through the hull. If this is done with anyone on board, well, they're dead. If any system is on, it's pretty much fried and most likely on fire. With this burst of energy, all the cables attached to the hull immediately detach and begin to simply drift away. They will be collected and repurposed by the locals. After all, it's legitimate salvage. On board the Frisian ship, Gora is being checked by their medical staff. Ricky is next to her watching the process after he gets a few of his blood samples taken as well. He is a bit put back by how luxurious and basically ostentatious this ship is. Even the medical bays are very wide open with thick cushioned beds and a multitude of calming colors and sounds. This made him a bit uncomfortable, as he was, in fact, a true fish out of water. Gordon was exhausted, basically almost asleep during the entire process, yet Ricky was definitely alert. He looked at the medical staff, and though they do not have the same gestures as humans, he kind of could tell something was off. When the Frisian captain and Captain Pope arrived, he clenched her hand very tight, so tight that she opened her eyes and actually told him to calm down a bit. Ricky could see them in the other room through the glass as they talked over there, and Ricky got very nervous as he realized that Captain Pope wasn't looking over. In fact, he was fighting the urge to turn over and look Ricky in the eyes. They came out a few moments later. Through a translator, the doc told them that the egg Gorna was carrying was not viable. This news hit them both as Ricky is fighting back his emotions, yet his hands were shaking just slightly. The doc explains that even though we believed fertilization was not possible, it did happen. It is of note that fertilization and carrying the egg to term is very different. If not for the increased egg size, her body would have simply absorbed it, seemingly what is done before. It is a very high probability that Gorna's body will break down the egg and cycle as normal. You should be grateful that you'll be back to perfect health. You can. It was at this point that Captain Pope put up his hands on the doc's shoulder and said, "That's enough. We can fill in the rest later. Right now, we should show these two to their temporary quarters." They are then led down a set of large hallways as Ricky holds up a trembling Gorna as she is trying to come to terms with what they just heard. When they enter their quarters, both captains said in their own respective ways, "If there's anything you need," Ricky just said, "We could use a little time." Without words, both captains understood as they looked at each other before leaving, realizing this is something that they just have to get over. As the couple mourned their loss, the Finchi royalty and the humans had a lot to discuss. This event is unprecedented and would take time and research to see if this is just a bump in the road or maybe a new beginning for both their peoples. Gorna and Ricky remained on the ship as they were scanned over and over. Additional samples were also taken to see what may have been the catalyst for all this event to happen. This was actually such a big deal that anybody who might have been outside the ship would have saw something interesting. The human flying bricks actually surrounded the Frisian ship and making an impenetrable wall around it to keep it safe. Many thought the pirates might try something stupid, but the losses taken when facing a simple human cargo ship made all the pirates think more than once about facing even a single human warship. After a few weeks, the couple were cleared to return to their jobs. Gorna was actually offered a higher paying position, but declined unless Ricky would join her. Eventually, there was a deal that they struck. Heading to a new location, it isn't long before they arrive just in time to their new location to see something amazing. Coming out of FTL near a planet in a forgotten zone, which is what her people call a sector of barren hell worlds, they saw massive flying bricks rising from the surface. On the surface, small oceans and rivers flow. Large swaths of green are beginning to cover the landscape, and once thick and violent atmosphere is now clear and calm. This is the very first planet just inside Forsha territory to be made habitable. This new planet was chosen to become a hub between humans and Forshi. This would be their new home. This planet has been christened Cobblestone in recognition of its importance between the two species and in recognition of the human bricks that made it. They look down at the planet and nearly are overwhelmed at the tasks of being planetary governors now. Gornaricia looks out the window at the planet and asks, "How are we going to manage such a massive undertaking? How are we going to build it up to what it needs to be?" Ricky doesn't even look at her as he squeezes her just a little tighter before responding, pulling her close. "The same way we humans always have, brick by brick."